Bitcoin transactions. In simple terms, a transaction tells the network that the owner of some Bitcoin value has authorized the transfer of that value to another owner. The new owner can now spend the Bitcoin by creating another transaction that authorizes the transfer to another owner, and so on, in a chain of ownership. Transaction inputs and outputs. Transactions are like lines in a double-entry bookkeeping ledger. Each transaction contains one or more inputs, which are like debits against a Bitcoin account. On the other side of the transaction, there are one or more outputs, which are like credits added to a Bitcoin account. The inputs and outputs do not necessarily add up to the same amount. Instead, outputs add up to slightly less than inputs, and the difference represents an implied transaction fee, which is a small payment collected by the miner who includes the transaction in the ledger. A Bitcoin transaction is shown as a bookkeeping ledger entry in the diagram below. The transaction also contains proof of ownership for each amount of Bitcoin whose value is being spent, in the form of a digital signature from the owner, which can be independently validated by anyone. In Bitcoin terms, spending is signing a transaction that transfers value from a previous transaction over to a new owner identified by a Bitcoin address. Transaction chains. Alice's payment to Bob's Cafe uses a previous transaction's output as its input. In the previous chapter, Alice received Bitcoin from her friend Joe in return for cash. That transaction created a Bitcoin value locked by Alice's key. Her new transaction to Bob's Cafe references the previous transaction as an input and creates new outputs to pay for the cup of coffee and receive change. The transactions form a chain, where the inputs from the latest transaction correspond to outputs from previous transactions. Alice's key provides the signature that unlocks those previous transaction outputs, thereby proving to the Bitcoin network that she owns the funds. She attaches the payment for coffee to Bob's address, thereby encumbering that output with the requirement that Bob produces a signature in order to spend that amount. This represents a transfer of value between Alice and Bob. This chain of transactions, from Joe to Alice to Bob, is illustrated in the diagram below, where the output of one transaction is the input of the next transaction. Making change. Many Bitcoin transactions will include outputs that reference both an address of the new owner and an address of the current owner, called the change address. This is because transaction inputs, like currency notes, cannot be divided. If you purchase a $5 item in a store but uses a $20 bill to pay for the item, you expect to receive $15 in change. The same concept applies to Bitcoin transaction inputs. If you purchased an item that costs 5 Bitcoin but only had a 20 Bitcoin input to use, your wallet would create a single transaction that sends two outputs, one output of 5 Bitcoin to the store owner, and one output of 15 Bitcoin back to yourself as change. Importantly, the change address does not have to be the same address as that of the input, and for privacy reasons is often a new address from the owner's wallet. Different wallets may use different strategies when aggregating inputs to make a payment requested by the user. They might aggregate many small inputs or use one that is equal to or larger than the desired payment. Unless the wallet can aggregate inputs in such a way to exactly match the desired payment plus transaction fees, the wallet will need to generate some change. This is very similar to how people handle cash. If you always use the largest bill in your pocket, you will end up with a pocket full of loose change. If you only use the loose change, you will always have only big bills. People subconsciously find a balance between these two extremes, and Bitcoin wallet developers strive to program this balance. In summary, transactions move value from transaction inputs to transaction outputs. An input is a reference to a previous transaction's output, showing where the value is coming from. The transaction usually includes an output that directs a specific value to a new owner's Bitcoin address and a change output back to the original owner. Outputs from one transaction can be used as inputs in a new transaction, thus creating a chain of ownership as the value is moved from owner to owner. Common transaction forms. The most common form of transaction is a simple payment from one address to another, which often includes some change returned to the original owner. This type of transaction has one input and two outputs and is shown in the diagram below. Another common form of transaction is one that aggregates several inputs into a single output. This represents the real-world equivalent of exchanging a pile of coins and currency notes for a single larger note. Transactions like these are sometimes generated by wallet applications to clean up lots of smaller amounts that were received as change for payments. Finally, another transaction form that is seen often on the Bitcoin ledger is a batched transaction, which distributes one input to multiple outputs representing multiple recipients, a technique called transaction batching. Since this type of transaction is useful for saving in transaction fees, it is commonly used by commercial entities to distribute funds, such as when a company is processing payroll payments to multiple employees, or when a Bitcoin exchange is processing multiple customers' withdrawals in a single transaction.